It seemed as if the heavens were foreshadowing his future. Despair fell across the villa as the rain continued to fall. It was as if the gods on high were weeping for the life the little one would be forced to live. The baby was placed in a dark room, the usual fanfare of a new life nowhere to be found. His father's disdain was evident on his face as he glared at what could only be the failure of his family's future. New to the world, soft and vulnerable, he slumbered, soaking in everything around him. The most hateful words escaped the lips of the baby's father, looking at what was to be his future. He couldn't imagine why the gods cursed them with such a disgusting thing. It was his misfortune that he was born on the same day and at the same time as Kajin. Blessed by the sword god Kashak, both his body and soul were overflowing with talent. His own mother regretted her part in giving birth to him. She wished more than anything that she had given birth to Kajin instead. It wasn't long before the little one knew the reason for such scorn. He was born a cripple, missing his right arm from the very start. A truth that he would never be able to forget, as he would be reminded of this ailment every day for the rest of his life. From the moment he was born, his mother whispered her deepest desire to him. More than anything, she wished her baby would die. But the little one wanted nothing more than to live a full life. And he knew his family's truth. He had known it from the moment he was conceived. He was his family's only hope. His father's obsession with being the patriarch of their family had never been fulfilled. His greatest wish was for his son to rise up over his brother's son. His very existence shattered those hopes the moment he was born. There was no way he would ever be better than Kajin, the blessed child. He could simply be summed up as a disgrace. Yes, that was exactly who he was. Kajin, on the other hand, was beloved by everyone around him. From the moment he was born, he had the affection of every maid for miles around. His smile could be said to rival even that of the most beautiful angel. And the worst part was that his family felt the need to compare him to such a perfect child. While Kajin was capable of walking, he was merely able to rock from side to side. When he finally managed to take his first steps, Kajin was already holding a blade. When he progressed to the point of being able to wield a blade, Kajin was already sensing mana and being trained in the Samayan family's swordsmanship techniques. And through all of this, Davin's family was aloof to his efforts, leaving him in a dark despair as he realized he would never be good enough for them. At some point, they gave up completely and became full supporters of his cousin. When he was 7, he was sent away to be his cousin's attendant. To the eyes of the world, his family had made the greatest sacrifice to send him to his beloved cousin to support both their upbringing. But the reality was his parents had sold him away for a mere 300,000 liden. And that's when Davin's life took a drastic turn. He was nothing more than a plaything used to amuse his malicious cousin, who sought every opportunity to humiliate him in an attempt to destroy him as a person. From the very start, his beloved cousin despised him, making him an outlet for his rage. Davin did everything he could to hold back the tears. They didn't fall because of pain or humiliation. He simply found it hard to endure the fact that countless humans were willing to turn a blind eye to his situation. Eventually, he realized that there was no humanity among any of them. He was sure things would have been different if his uncle was still around. But long ago, he packed up his things and left the family, never to return. It was the reason for Kajin's upbringing. Not having a strong male figure in his life led him down the path of being no better than a tyrant, who used his blessings to bully anyone who stepped in his path. After all, being blessed by the gods meant he was beyond reproach. Fair play and sportsmanship weren't in his vocabulary. You didn't surrender in his presence, and not take the full consequences. And no matter what, he always fell back on abusing his favorite target. Davin was truly jealous of the innate talent Kajin wielded. He strived for strength. Because of this, he was willing to meet his abusers, assault face on. But what were his chances when the mere thought of his progress infuriated his cousin, causing him to use every ounce of his ability to put down Davin? He had no problem with the one-armed loser attempting to rise above his station, but he would be there every time to put the trash in his place. After all, no matter how much effort he put in, he would never be able to touch Kajin's genius. But Davin's determination to succeed never ceased or waned. The hard work alone wasn't enough to overcome the gap between the two. Even as Kajin dropped his training to become indulgent in the cardinal pleasures of spirits, drugs, and sex, Davin still came out as second best. After all, Kajin was a lazy genius, and he was nothing more than a hard-working idiot. But their positions in life wouldn't remain the same forever. In a coliseum filled to the brim, Kajin and Davin went at it like they had countless times before, both intent on destroying the other. But this time, things were going to be different. This time, he was like a man possessed, intent on breaking through the wall that had been holding him back his entire life. He unleashed an attack directly towards his cousin, making his move the moment the distraction was let loose. He came down with the intent to kill. The two made contact as an explosion rippled through the Colosseum. The crowd watched on, shocked, each and every one of them on the edge of their seats. When the smoke cleared, the one-armed Davin stood victorious. To this day, out of 21 official bouts, he had been defeated 21 times. But after a hard-fought journey that took 29 years, he had finally brought Kajin to his knees. In all those years, he had been beaten down by the hands of his cousin. He had every scar that proved the torment that he suffered. Each time he was thrown to the ground, he was told that he would never amount to anything. That he was nothing more than an idiot wasting his time. But here he was, the victor. And the crowd went wild. After all, everyone loves an underdog. The two locked eyes staring each other down. Kajin couldn't believe he had lost to this loser. And the words that hunted Davin's dreams ran through his head. If only you were Kajin. If only Kajin was my son. But the truth was, if he was Kajin, he wouldn't have lived such a life. There was no way he would have wasted his life on such destructive vices. He would have risen to the occasion instead of becoming a tyrant who trampled the weak. With that, Davin turned away, leaving his cousin on the ground, shamed by the actions of a better man. Davin could finally move on. The journey he had begun the moment he was born was over. His eyes opened wide as a blade burst from his chest. The crowd went wild. Each and every one of them had witnessed the ultimate betrayal. A crooked grin spread across Davin's face. His cousin was a slimy bastard to the very end. He didn't want to die, but it seems as if fate didn't want him to live. After all, the illustrious Sunblade, a majestic sword steeped in the heritage of the Samayon lineage, entrusted solely to the direct line of the family's legacy, was his undoing. This sword harnessed the very essence of his family's mana, cocooned in an aura of anti-magic marvel. A lifeline could only emerge if Saint Layla graced the scene, for without her presence, his survival teetered on the precipice of impossibility. As fate ran its course, the solace he clung to in the passage to the beyond was the assurance that the name Kajin would forever be synonymous with defeat. As Davin's consciousness embarked on its ethereal journey, he awakened in a realm shrouded in an enigma, an abyssal dungeon of unparalleled desolation. Held captive by immobility, certainty enveloped him. He had descended into the very abyss of hell itself. A sardonic chuckle escaped his keeper's lips as he contemplated the irony. Could this truly be his infernal reckoning? How astonishing that one so entwined with the threads of misfortune could find himself steeped in an uncanny stroke of luck. What were the astronomical odds that the miraculous Saint Layla, the embodiment of the extraordinary, would grace the arena precisely in these fateful moments? Davin was abruptly thrust into the unforgiving embrace of reality. The saintly figure had extended her divine touch to cleanse a wretched, filthy soul like his. A repugnant existence mended by the purity of the pristine. His thoughts swirled in a maelstrom of contradiction. If he had been granted this miraculous salvation, why then did his frail form bear the scars of neglect? At this moment, his existence was distilled to a singular essence, bare survival, as each breath drew the fragile line between him and oblivion. His keeper's voice, veiled in an inquiry he no longer needed, pierced the air. The outcome had been etched long before. Had he, perhaps, inked a pact with the devil? Davin's response rippled as a shockwave through the colossal figure. Revelation followed. The sole route for a perennial loser like Davin to vanquish the formidable Kajin rested in a pact with infernal forces. Even his own kin had confessed to this truth, dispelling any pretense of ignorance he could muster. A wry grin painted his lips, a realization etched in the final chapters of his journey. His parents, steadfastly consistent, continued their legacy of disappointment. In his abode, a gruesome tableau was unveiled, vessels brimming with the crimson essence of life, and offerings of sacrifice poised for the consummation of your infernal pact. As whispers circulate, he emerged as the architect of a diabolic design, bartering the lives of 300 innocent souls upon the altar of power, his very essence tethered to their extinguished light. Davin's actions had forced the unthinkable upon Kajin's shoulders. Think of the sorrow and sadness, a beloved cousin forced to put down his childhood friend to protect the name of his family. The puzzle came crashing together as Davin realized he was able to defeat Kajin, but not the Samayon family. In the end, they chose Kajin over him. And in an attempt to cover up the truth, they had sealed his mana and would force him to serve a life sentence, which meant he would rot in this dungeon until he pulled his last breath. They had no intention of taking any chances. Every tendon in his body had been sliced through, and his mana was sealed under the embrace of life-draining chains. In that very condition, he was tossed into a prison cell for a supposed eternity. It wasn't long before he was visited by his beloved cousin Kajin. Finally, the one-armed loser had been put in his rightful place. Because of Davin's actions, Kajin was being praised the world over as a hard-working genius. He now held the new title of Sword Emperor. His visit was in thanks to Davin. Because of his useless cousin, he was elevated to his rightful status in life. And always one to kick a dog when he's down, Kajin made sure Davin's rations were reduced. It wasn't long before he became a fraction of the man he was. His family had prevailed in an attempt to starve him of all sources of life. Why couldn't he have died with honor? Would it have been too much for him to ask for death in the arena, on the day of his greatest victory? With blood seeping from his lips, he slid to the ground, as the warmth from his body seeped into the stone. If he had been born whole, would he have lived a different life? If he had been born in the direct line, and blessed by the sword god Kashak, if those things had come to bear, would his life have been whole? And the very stubbornness that held him aloft as an infant rose. He didn't want to die. As he faded from reality, he held to the simple truth that he wanted to live. His eyes shot open, but he was unable to pay any attention to the furious individual screaming in his face. Besides calling him by a name he didn't recognize, they felt the need to squeeze his right arm, sending pain signals shooting to his brain. Davin didn't understand how any of this was real. Surely, he was only dreaming. The knowledge of the individual in front of him popped into his brain. The furious man was an elder from a branch family. He was sure the individual had referred to him as Vinchin, the seventh son of the Adenka family. The stray memories were starting to unsettle him. Compared to his previous life, if this dream was a reality, he doubted he would mind it all that much. He would take the fresh air and freedom any day over the dank underground of a dungeon. If the dream poofed, and he went back to the death that awaited him, he would always cherish this precious gift of knowing what it was like to be normal. The elder was done with his nonsense. He began to attack Davin. Forcing a foreign mana source into his body would only cause him pain. Luckily, he had the knowledge to counter such an attack. Severing the contact his attacker had on his body would nullify the effects. But more surprising was the force at which he sent the elder flying. His attack shouldn't have affected the mana user to such a degree. Davin hurriedly apologized. His intent was never to do any harm. His gesture to solve the problem was rudely rejected. The elder had no need for his aid. Him being a part of the main family didn't mean he could do as he pleased. When the time came, his son would crush him, and a branch family would rise above the main family for the first time in history. The dreams of this elder ran hand in hand with the dreams of his father, who lived his life with the hopes of defeating Davin's uncle. The moment he realized he couldn't achieve his dreams with his own two hands, he began to project it onto his future offspring, which ultimately led to the disappointment of all involved. The elder was done with the rudeness and arrogance, it was all beneath him. The assembly of true swords wasn't far off, and when that time came, he would be put in his place. Davin watched the angered elder leave, as he let go of the pent-up tension he held for his father. He sat back in the chair, coming to the conclusion that this was definitely not a dream. It wasn't long before more memories began to invade his psyche. His mother had passed away in the process of birthing him, leading to his father's scorn of his very existence, and his siblings using him as a scapegoat for their pent-up tension. He was the seventh of 8 children of the famous family Adenka. He was such a coward that even his younger sister had no problems dominating him, forcing him into isolation as he cried away his sorrows. Being the outcast to his family left him vulnerable to the advances of the branch families. He was easy prey, and none of them was going to waste such an opportunity. Davin had gone from being the one-armed loser of the Samayan family to becoming the cowardly Vinchin of the Adenka family. He was sure this would fit into the category of reincarnation. If he was going to make this work, he had no choice but to educate himself. The diary of the body's former owner was just depressing. Why couldn't he do what his elder siblings could? His kin was attempting to use him as a ladder to success. Even his maids and attendants ignored him. He was defective, and he wished it all would end. Davin couldn't take Vinchin downing himself at every opportunity. The kid had fallen down and simply gave up on life. From what he could tell, their prayers had been answered. He longed for life while Vinchin was looking to escape it. One disappeared from the world, and the other rose into his place. A voice popped into his head, assuring him that his logic was absurd. Davin went on full alert. He had no idea how someone managed to sneak up on him. The voice in his head couldn't believe how simple he was. He had no problems fighting off any demons who thought they could take away this gift. Even if the reincarnation wasn't meant to happen, it was done, and the body belonged to him now. The voice couldn't take his line of logic, putting it plainly so Davin could understand. He was the original owner of the body. If he was the original owner, that meant he was none other than Vinchin. Davin had hit the nail on the head. But the fact that he gave up his body meant he was no longer Vinchin. So he introduced himself as Julian. The spirit before his eyes bore his resemblance. If it wasn't for the blonde hair, the two would be a spitting image for each other. Davin had no idea how any of this worked. But Julian explained it was simply a revelation. He was sure revelations were the things that gods gave to humans. And only the ones who were blessed were capable of hearing them. And he understood Julian was explaining that he himself was a god. He smiled, relieved that Davin wasn't as slow as he originally believed. He was indeed a god, even if at the moment he was only a minor one. His original intent was for a great spirit to take over his body, but instead Davin had crawled in. In order for him to become a true god, there were numerous achievements he had to accomplish. Better known as a calling. It was his only path to raise his station to a true god. Davin understood, but he didn't see how any of it was his problem. Now that he had another chance at life, he had no intentions of wasting it. He would be busy living his new life, and the wishes of a spirit didn't amount to much. Julian didn't begrudge him any of it. After all, he tossed away his life. As long as Davin could handle the fact that the spiritual energy of that body was very low. And when it ran out, he too would cease to exist. He couldn't believe how bad Julian was at this. Such a shallow threat meant nothing when he clearly knew that this body was beyond healthy. The moment he thought it, he realized his error. The bastard had indeed set him up. Julian wasn't heartless. He had attempted to warn the new occupant of his body. But the naivety of humans never ceased to amaze him. Now that he had the full undivided attention of his new host, the true education would commence. The unfiltered memories flooded in like an avalanche. Davin was barely able to withstand the onslaught. His eyes opened wide as he realized the implications. The joy that the body felt as his siblings attempted to stump him into submission. He wasn't cowering away. He was begging for more. The expression he hid from them all was truly telling. He hadn't fallen to despair. He was merely playing the part of a coward, biding his time until he could enact his ultimate revenge. How was these the thoughts of a mere adolescent? And exactly what kind of world had he been forced into? The look on his host's face told him everything he needed to know about his flawless acting skills. In order to escape the surveillance of his family, he had no choice but to pull the wool over their eyes. After all, the subjects he needed to study was way beneath his standing in life. He was sure the host wouldn't be opposed to hearing him out now. If he was right, and he usually was, he was sure they both would gain from his proposition. Having no choice, Davin agreed to listen. Julian went straight for the juggler. Do you know the tale of the archdemon Davin and the hero King Kajin? Davin rose from his seat, not believing the words that left the spirit's mouth. Davin screamed the words back at the spirit. The absurdity of them was simply beyond believable. The horrors took place 500 years ago. The one-armed swordsman, Davin, escaped from the Samian's prison, leaving a swash of destruction in his wake. The contract he made with the demon was the key to his strength. He used it to devour thousands of children in his quest for power. The exact number of deaths is yet unknown, but it's believed to be in the tens of thousands. The great travesty sealed his fate as an archdemon throughout history. He had traveled 500 years into the future, and he still wasn't able to outrun the deception of his family. Davin couldn't deny the validity of the accusations. There was no way there was another Davin and Kajin from the Samion family bloodline. He was sure he died in the prison. The condition he was in 500 years ago was deplorable. The Samion family abandoned the one-armed man in favor of the storm sword, while the one-armed swordsman died a lonely cripple. The storm sword rose to the position of the sword emperor. Davin couldn't believe any of this bullshit. The audacity of them to not only do what they did, but to also fabricate history. His former family was indeed his truest enemies. And for them to portray Kaijin as the hero king, who to the very end, was a true friend to the archdemon. To think people felt these lies were romantic. Davin was doing all he could to hold himself in check, but the spirit was pushing all the right buttons. The story was simply crazy. None of it was real. Every word was a simple fabrication. The spirit was astonished. For him to know that could only mean he was someone from that era. Davin had no problem admitting it. Only for the spirit to insist that the old man should calm down. After all, history was written by the victors. He couldn't believe he was in a world where mere children uttered such insightful scripture. Kids from this era were most definitely growing up too fast. It was best if he heard the story to its end, so he took a seat and calmly insisted the spirit continue. The hero king forced his sorrow away and decided to work with the world's greatest hero and his best friend, the Sun Sword Emperor, to bring the archdemon Davin to his knees. In Davin's 29 years of life, he had never heard of the Sun Sword Emperor. The spirit explained that Arslan was the Adenka family's ancestor. The name Arslan definitely rang a bell. To think that little brat ended up becoming the founding patriarch of the Adenka family. He could recall the very first moment they met. The little blue-eyed brat was fully infatuated with his existence. His dream was to grow up to be like the one-armed swordsman. He couldn't imagine what the kid saw in him, but instead of running him off, Davin brought him in, making him his disciple. Arslan was the first person who he was able to call family. When Davian was in prison, Arslan was his only true visitor, coming to see him on multiple occasions. The only one who knew the truth and was hell-bent on bringing it to the light. Arslan was determined to recover Davin's honor, long after he stopped caring. After that day, he never laid eyes on his young disciple again. He went on to form the Adenka family and left his life mission in their hands. And all of this was related to his calling, which was to rise above the Samion family and to reveal the truth to the world. This just couldn't be a coincidence. His disciples' last words were that he would uncover the truth no matter what it took. And he was the only person that knew Davin had been wrong. There was no way any of this was simply by chance. He had no idea of all the pieces in play, but he was certain of this. Arslan Falker renounced his family and founded his own legacy, all for the sake of truth. Him being reborn into this family was nothing more than fate. Julian was of the family Adenka, and his calling was to fulfill his family's ultimate mission. He would then become a true god upon completion of the calling. And if that happened, Davin would become the owner of his new body. And said God would be forever in his debt. In the end, the spirit was true to his word. His achievement would truly benefit both of them. Davin gave all thanks to his beloved little brother Arslan. Going forward, he would take over the mission his disciple left behind, destroying the Samayan family, and climbing above that traitorous family and becoming a true part of this one. He had no time to waste. He set out on his mission immediately. But sadly, he knew this spirit Julian was going to pester him the whole way. He wasn't going to take kindly to being mocked. But in Julian's opinion, anyone who was 500 years old was most definitely an old man. Being the old man, it was probably best that he called off this calling before it began. The spirit's tone quickly changed. The title of brother suited Davin much better. The crossing of swords pulled their attention from their bickering. Davin couldn't imagine how much martial arts had changed in the past 500 years. It was almost assured that this era did things differently. As he watched the sparring, his mind wandered to the Samayan family. He was sure Kajin's defendants had grown, but he had no idea to what extent. A smile spread across his face, his heart raced in the anticipation of finding out. His training started off entirely too slow. The body he inherited was a total mess. Vinchin hadn't put any effort into its upkeep, leaving him with a piece of trash that was going to take entirely too much effort to regulate. He was forced to use mana to control it, otherwise he wouldn't be able to sustain a normal life. But in the process, he came to the ultimate discovery. He screamed for the spirit. There was no way he didn't know. Julian appeared, wondering what the commotion was after being awoken from his deepest slumbers. He needed to know why the child hadn't learned swordsmanship. It turned out a disability had made it impossible for him to pursue. Such a choice wasn't the appropriate outcome. As it turned out, this body possessed the heavenly exoskeleton. He was furious that the child hadn't been taught swordsmanship from the moment he was able to walk. The spirit broke free of Davin's embrace. He had no idea what a heavenly exoskeleton was or why it was such a big deal. The condition allowed the one who possessed it the ability to store mana anywhere. But more specific, it allowed you to store mana in your bones. Julian's demeanor told Davin everything he needed to know. He was going to have to go into more detail. For martial artists, the ability to store mana allowed for transcendent strength beyond that of a normal human. The mana that allowed for this miracle was usually stored in the human's heart. But select few who possessed the heavenly exoskeleton were capable of storing endless amounts of mana. He was impressed to hear that all this time he possessed something of that nature. But Devin didn't believe the spirit truly understood how big a deal this was. Kajin, the person they all called the Hero King, was blessed at birth with the very same exoskeleton. It was ironic that he had been reincarnated into a body with the very blessing he had always longed to have. The world was much different than it had been, more than he could ever anticipate. That night, after explaining the blessing to Julian, the spirit broke down the reality of this era. He specifically had never been able to link imagery to his heart. Davin was completely lost. Now it was his opportunity to break things down for the old man. Imagery was essentially an imaginary storage for your mana. The revelation set Davin off. He couldn't believe that people didn't store mana in their heart. If people had done away with such techniques, he had to know what meditation methods were used. Julian had no idea what he was getting at. He was simply dumbfounded by the question. Davin knew for sure that his first ancestor Arslan had a superior meditation technique for storing mana in the heart. Such barbaric techniques just weren't taught anymore in their current time period. People store mana through imagery, and they call each a star. The number of stars correlated with the strength of the martial artist. He doubted anyone even had records of the techniques from 500 years ago. Their conversation was an eye-opener. Davin stared into the night sky, doing his best to figure out how things worked in this era. The qualifications of becoming a one-star was the ability to feel mana and to link an imagery for the first time. He could tell that imagery was created to eliminate the risk that came with storing mana in the heart. It was quite common for more than half of martial artists to die from the process. In these cases, the heart would simply explode. But the technique was always known to bring results. At the onset of his actions, the spirit began to panic. Davin could feel this body and knew its heart was strong. If they wanted to get anything done, learning the technique was a must. After all, the one-armed Davin excelled at it. Julian couldn't believe how sloppy this was. The old man's mana was flying everywhere. Did the people of the past not have a circuit formula? In Davin's opinion, if the spirit knew something, he should spit it out. No one simply allowed their mana to flow out all willy-nilly. In order for you to get the most out of it, you had to process it using a mana formula to aid with its efficiency. The spirit was sure, if this was how everyone did it 500 years ago, a lot of people had to fail. Davin agreed with his observation. The failure rate was a little under half. Julian was mortified. He needed Davin to at least attempt to treat his body as if it was precious. He couldn't believe Julian felt his former body was precious. Obviously, Davin believed it was. But from the state he received it in, he dared the spirit to start caring about it now. The body was an ultimate treasure. To be born with a heavenly exoskeleton, a strong heart and magic power circuit, if only he had cherished it from the very beginning, it would be an unstoppable force. His exoskeleton not only allowed you to store mana in it, but it needed to have mana stored in it. For over 13 years, Julian had starved his skeleton nearly to death. If it had gone on much longer, there was no way Vincent Adenka would have made it to adulthood. There was a limit to what he could accomplish with meditation alone. He was sure that this body only had about 10 years of life left in it. But 10 years was long enough. It was the exact amount of time it took for the world to forget about one-armed Davin, and for the crooked Kajin to rise to the lofty position of Sword Emperor. It was the amount of time it took Davin to starve as he longed for a chance at life. Those 10 years were the longest, most horrifying years of his life. His endless meditation had finally attracted attention. The intruder forced his way in, determined to find the cause of all the commotion. Davin assumed that the intruder was one of Vincent's servants. He had been warned about this particular individual. His name was Wilson. He had plans to slit this individual's throat in a little under 3 years. He needed to stop hesitating. If he was going to fix the reputation built by Julian, he would need to start reacting. He ripped off his clothes and tossed them to the servant. There was no better place to start asserting his authority than right here. He ordered that this mess be promptly tidied up. Wilson couldn't put his finger on what was going on. This couldn't be the weakling Vincent. Besides his demeanor, he was given off an aura of strength. The mess was so unusual, Wilson needed to know if the young master was performing some type of unusual experiment. Davin simply assured him that wasn't the case. He was determined to find out what happened to the child who was ignored all his life, who remained in his room reading instead of risking there being an opportunity for him to be humiliated in front of the rest of the household. He had to report this to the Grand Chamberlain. If there was a chance that the young master was mixed up in dark magic, they needed to let the Patriarch know immediately. Davin had never come across someone who talked so formally while spouting nothing but bullshit. He couldn't believe this servant was foolish enough to insinuate his master was up to nefarious deeds, while ignoring the commands he was obviously given. The days of him being lenient was over. Going forward, the maid would do his job. It wasn't going to be that easy. Wilson wasn't interested in doing things he didn't like. And he definitely wasn't here to pick up after the coward. Davin's fury began to rise. He was sure he was dealing with a servant. But instead of losing his cool, he decided to be tactful. He snatched away his clothes. He would go get them on his own. Wilson paled at the idea, inquiring where the coward believed he was headed. He was going to visit the Grand Chamberlain himself, to inquire about receiving new clothes since his servant was incapable of handling the task. That was all it took for Wilson to snap to attention, removing the clothes from his master's hand and ensuring him that it would be handled. Regardless of how cowardly Vincent was, it made no sense for a servant to be so arrogant. All he could think of was that someone put him in this position on purpose. Julian agreed with him. He had always felt something was strange when it came to the situation with his servants. It was highly likely a test Julian had failed years ago. If handled correctly, the seventh son of the Adenka family would have immediately put that servant in his place. Even as a spirit, he was scared of what Julian was capable of. The reputation that the servant carried was that he was once a gang member who was fond of killing countless individuals. Davin doubted that was the case, as killers had a certain energy about them. And what he got from reading Wilson was that he was an innocent coward, very much like Vincent. Julian really hoped that Davin wasn't the one who was bullshitting. After all, how was he able to assume these things after a single meeting? But the answer was simple. He had once lived such a life. Julian didn't know what to do with himself. How had he summoned something scarier than a spirit king? Wilson announced himself before entering the young master's room, carrying in his master's fresh laundered clothes. He had also done an amazing job making the room sparkle. Davin agreed to try not to turn it into a disaster zone again. His relaxed attitude gave Wilson a false sense of security, prompting him to begin his plotting. He actually believed that it was a good idea. Fresh off of his previous task, Davin sent him to accomplish another mission. He needed a wooden sword made of black scented wood, about a meter long and weighing about 500 grams. If he was correct, there should be a ton of them in the family storeroom. Wilson, fresh on one, inquired what would happen if he refused. If Davin's servant wasn't willing to do it, he would have to go retrieve it himself. But he wanted to know how he should answer the storeroom gatekeeper when he asked why the young master had come himself. Wilson was taking his education very hard, but Davin felt he would eventually surrender to the inevitable. Wilson didn't understand why Vincent was acting this way. He had no problem doing his job. He made a critical error when he grabbed Davin from behind. The gesture triggered something instinctual, causing him to immediately attack. He apologized for the extreme reaction, explaining that he had bad memories of being attacked from behind. The excuse didn't sit well with Wilson. He had never heard of such a trauma. Either way, Davin was sure Wilson would never grab him from behind. It was ridiculous how weak his body was. Just that single maneuver caused his body to scream in pain. Wilson climbed to his feet with the intent of putting the young master in his place. But the murderous intent of Davin's side eye calmed his soul, causing him to immediately remember the mission he was given. A meter-long, black-scented sparring sword it is. Davin reinforced his dominance, as Wilson hurriedly removed himself from his young master's vicinity. He rushed back in to apologize for the slamming of the door, blaming it on the wind. Davin didn't even have a problem with it, but it was refreshing nonetheless. Rage consumed the servant as he marched through the halls of the villa. He wouldn't be outdone by the weakest member of this household. Before he was through, the young master would fear the name Wilson. The servant returned with the practiced sword with the intent of making his master work for it. But Davin's mind was somewhere else, inquiring if Wilson knew that among the people he knew very well, there was one who didn't have a right arm. The statement came out of right field, dumbfounding Wilson in the process. Simply being born without an arm had caused the individual to lead a very tough life, which led to the tragic ending of his life. Wilson didn't know what his master was on, but decided now wasn't the time for his defiance, offering the sword up like a diligent servant. The whole process was beneath him, and before another errand could be levied in his direction, he took his leave. The piece of wood was exactly what Davin needed. A little training was in order. In the middle of the courtyard, in front of any prying eyes, he took swings at a practice dummy. The body was in far worse shape than he believed, even with him knowing that the heavenly exoskeleton was extremely weak. It made no sense that he tired himself out after only a few swings. But regardless, the repetition felt good. He was most definitely born to be a martial artist. Before he could land his next attack, the dummy was severed in two. Shocked by the blatant intrusion, he searched for the person responsible. A blonde-haired swordsman apologized for his actions. He hadn't realized that someone was training on the field, as the magical energy radiating from the area was extremely weak. Davin paid little attention to the taunt, instead inquiring the identity of the pompous individual. The cocky blonde introduced himself as Revan Adenka. But he didn't need introductions, as he could tell that the weakling was none other than the mainline Adenka brat with no talent, Vinchin. Davin remained silent as the information on Revan flooded into his brain. Revan was a member of a sub-family far removed from the main line. For such a situation, having Julian in his ear was invaluable. Revan was the predicted victor of the Assembly of the True Swords, and he was pretty sure that Davin had already had the pleasure of meeting the blonde's father. Being the son of that guy, this all was starting to make sense. He was a rising star among the collateral descendants, the most skilled in their age group. Seeing as how he was going to be the victor of the assembly, it makes sense that he introduced himself to his future opponent. A grand spectacle known as the Assembly of True Swords was a gathering of martial progeny intertwined with the Adenka lineage, converging to engage in fierce combat with blades unsheathed. Although no stringent age boundaries exist, tradition finds its roots as participants typically embark on this journey at the age of 14. Amidst this martial communion, an exquisite opportunity awaits the ultimate victor, a duel against the Adenka clan's direct scion, whose years align in synchrony. It is this triumph in the hallowed Assembly of True Swords that ushers forth the chance to face none other than the unassuming Vinchin, the acknowledged feeble link among the esteemed lineage of direct heirs. Revan's goal was to ensure that the Adenka mainline coward wouldn't run from the assembly. After all, the battle wouldn't end in wooden swords. Davin felt the boast was silly, as he had never met a martial artist who was afraid of swords. The blonde praised him on his smooth tongue. He assumed that was something that was passed down through the direct line. But Devin assured him it wasn't, encouraging the blonde to put some effort into his wordplay as well. After all, if you were going to attempt to provoke your betters, it should at least carry a level of dignity and class. To think he came all this way to attack a relative who was only trying to better himself. How rude is that? Even when he only had one arm, he was respected on the training grounds. And the likes of Kajin, may his soul forever burn in hell, extended the mantle of respect on the sparring stage. The actions that Revan had showed today were simply shameful. As a martial artist, he ought to be embarrassed. But what could you expect when his father was that guy? He doubted the kid had ever been taught manners in his entire life. Insulting his father crossed the line. Revan immediately sent a warning blow towards Davin's head. Because of such an attack, there would be no forgiveness. Julian warned him of what he was dealing with. Revan was at the level of 2 stars, and possessed the attributes of a steel man. This really wasn't a battle they could win today. But he couldn't let this ride. It was obvious that the blonde had an inferiority complex from being a collateral descendant. Davin was greeted with a hostile mana attack. When it was obvious, he couldn't defend himself, seeing as how Vinchin possessed no control over mana. His father acts like a child who raised his son without the etiquette that a martial artist must possess. Maybe it was just the times, but in his era this would have never took place. He decided it was his responsibility to pass on the lesson that Revan's insufferable father should have taught him. Back in his day. In the blink of an eye, Davin raised his sword within an inch of making contact. The family's elders wouldn't have tolerated such insolence. Revan definitely hadn't expected the coward to bear his weapon. With no mana and 0 imagery, the confidence that was being radiated made no sense. As he faced the sword grazing his brow, he knew that Vinchin had no chance of defeating him. The vibes that he was putting off told the tale of a man who could easily cut him down. Davin retracted his weapon, insisting that if a wooden sword brought him such fear, how could he ever face him in the Assembly of True Swords? After all, in the Assembly, their fight wouldn't end in wooden swords. Davin's eyes radiated victory, which set Revan off, forcing him over the edge as he charged forward with the intent to kill. His eyes told the tale of an ill-mannered child who had lost control. While Julian panicked, Davin had no worries, knowing that the fool couldn't wound him. To his disappointment, interference stepped in at the last minute. Someone looking out for Revan's best interest pinned his arms behind his head. As the blonde struggled for freedom, Julian let out a sigh of relief. Injuring the young master would only give him the opportunity to evade a fight at the Assembly of True Swords. He would have his opportunity, but for the moment patience was a virtue. Revan would get his revenge at the assembly when he destroyed the coward. Julian was confused by Davin's actions. If Revan's guard hadn't stepped in, they could have been seriously injured. Davin assured him all he did was teach an insufferable child a lesson. The spirit couldn't understand how he ended up with such a boomer. If only his plans had gone through, he would have a powerful spirit king at his disposal. Davin apologized, but he assured Julian he was doing all he could to make this work for the both of them. While studying, he came across a portrait of a young Vincian, only to have it snatched away by the spirit. They needed to focus. Now that they were done with the theory of imagery, it was time to move on to blessings and traits. The topic of traits was a new one for Davin. To the best of his understanding, there wasn't an equivalent in his era. As it turned out, traits were artificially created with the power analyzed from blessings. Essentially, blessings made by the hands of man. The idea of such a thing was absurd. Such blasphemy would only call down the wrath of the gods. The number of times he had disrespected the god floating in front of him, and here he was worried about other people's divine punishments. As he had mentioned, Revan possessed the attribute known as Steel Man. It in and of itself was a trait. The blessing of the Dwarf King had many benefits, but his main trait focused on strengthening the body. As you honed your traits, new, more powerful paths were unlocked. The process was known as a tech tree. Steel Man was a mid-level trait specializing in defense and destructive force. Davin felt that such nonsense would unbalance a martial artist at their core. Julian assured him it allowed said artist to be stronger, much faster. Davin knew this to be true. What Revan had done with a wooden sword to the training dummy would have been beyond the skill set of someone of the same age from his era. If this is what traits were capable of, he would need to familiarize himself with all of them if he was going to stand a chance against kids of this era. The training ground was Davin's home away from home. He spent his time slowly building himself up, one swing at a time. Onlookers had started to take notice of the young Adenka. For starters, the use of his left hand meant that he had no room to cast imagery. Not that that would be a problem, seeing as how he would become winded as soon as he stepped on the training grounds. In the middle of their gossiping, a voice cut them off, rebuking them for their words. White Sword Unit Vice Captain Merlin. The vice captain had no idea what was hilarious about a young master of the Adenka family attempting to better himself. The servants apologized as they immediately retreated from the training grounds. The rumors about the young one being the shame of the Adenka family were spot on. Any untrained individual could tell he lacked skill or talent. Watching such a spectacle, he couldn't blame the servants for looking down on him. Julian couldn't understand why they couldn't train in the forest. It would save them from the piercing eyes of the onlookers. But they had neither the time nor the stamina for such nonsense. None of it bothered Davin. He was used to being looked down upon. As the one-armed Davin, it was a common occurrence. But in the end, he succeeded. He converted their criticism into the fuel needed to eventually surpass all of them. And he was sure he could do it again. As he rested, a gloved hand forced a vial into his face. The advanced recovery potion would aid him in his training. The vice captain introduced himself as Merlin to the young Adenka. Davin was surprised this was the first person he came across that understood the seriousness of his actions. Merlin admitted in the beginning he was just like the others. But in the process, he was drawn to the eyes of the young master. The eyes of a true martial artist wasn't to be mocked. Anyone who thought differently should be the ones who's laughed at. Davin promised the vice captain that he wouldn't forget his name. He had to be keeping the vice captain from his patrols, so he apologized and bid him farewell. As Merlin left, he wished the young master good luck. Something truly had changed in him, and he hoped it was for the better. Davin rushed the training dummy, sending blow after blow in its direction. After the short exchange, he took a seat to sip on his recovery potion. While he trained in the day, at night he studied, with the spirit Julian hovering over his shoulder. The endless repetition was doing its job as he finally started to see results. His foot movements were beginning to be in line with the posture of his body. And at long last, he was beginning to feel the mana in his heart, as he started to see one-armed Davin's path to defeating Kajin. The trajectory of his attack could be seen with his bare eyes as dots with a line running through it. If he managed to connect them, his ability would be manifested. A purple aura encompassed his sword as he finally managed to sever the training dummy. At long last, he was finally successful and his unique technique was complete. Wilson was getting tired of this new, more productive young master. You would think he was a rooster, seeing as how he demanded food as early as 5 in the morning. After countless days of obedience, it was finally time for him to take back his throne. He removed the dome, chanting that breakfast was served. Davin calmly stared at the sad attempt to rile him up. The attack would have worked so much better if Wilson hadn't made it so obvious. Davin pointed out the food smudges that adorned his face. Wilson's unsuccessful attempt to hide the evidence was only making it worse. Davin had no problems overlooking it this time, seeing as how the whole situation was simply cute. But while this was tolerable, he really hoped the servant understood there was a line he mustn't cross. As a last-ditch effort, he verbalized the fact that he was once a backstreet gangster, who was famous for his body count. As Davin savaged what he could from the meal, he expressed mock fear from hearing such tales. He decided that Wilson should be the first to know he was capable of using mana. Controlling through fear is quite easy, but doing so will never gain you trust. It's the reason why I'm merely pressuring you with my power. Wilson was completely shocked by the voice in his head. He wondered when his young master had progressed to the point of a mana user. When didn't matter, what was important was the fact that he could use mana. It was time for the servant to swallow his pride and stand by his side. After all, it wouldn't be long before having Vinchinadenka as his master would cease to bring him embarrassment. In the end, it was going to be up to him whether he was ruled by fear or willingly pledged his loyalty. As Wilson left, he wondered how the soft pressure his master was placing upon him could transform into loyalty. He would have to think on this problem, but in the meantime, he had to watch out for his master's explosive charm, as all that riz was just too much. As Merlin made his daily rounds, he was disappointed to see that Master Vinchin had retired early. But that disappointment transformed into astonishment as he laid his eyes on the training dummy. He knew the young master only used a wooden blade, but he had never heard of such explosive growth being possible in such a short amount of time. The hairs rose on the back of Merlin's neck at the mere thought of how strong Vinchinadenka could become. Things were finally starting to fall into place. And in some cases, a little too well. Julian was positively giddy at the domestication of his former barbarian servant. Conquering a difficult person requires not only strength but also the wisdom to turn their resistance into cooperation. Now that he had time to focus, Davin was starting to notice a few inconsistencies. For starters, his clothes were made of levidine cotton. While being cost-effective, it wasn't eco-friendly, as the growing process ruined the soil. And as such, it wasn't suitable for a noble of his stature. On top of that, the quality of their food was subpar in comparison to the family's budget. To Julian, the food had always been delicious, so he hadn't noticed a problem with its quality. They had a thief among them. Someone was embezzling the Adenka family's coffers. A single glance toward Wilson ruled him out completely. He was still stuck on the word levidine. Only a servant who had their hands in all forms of their life would be capable of accomplishing such a task. Revan's weighted blade cut through the air. He had been training nonstop since his encounter with Davin, whose words echoed around his skull. The confident coward infuriated him. He would show that Adenka brat who was scared. The commotion attracted the attention of his father. Impressed that his son's training was going well. Revan was the hope of their family, if they stood any chance of escaping the life of poverty and sorrow that came with being nothing more than a collateral descendant. His son had to defeat Vinchin. His old man grabbed his arm. He couldn't just know. He had to believe. Revan had to become the first branch family member that succeeded in toppling the main family. He did his best to assure his father, but as the assembly drew closer, he only became more irritable. And day by day his obsession with the competition continued to worsen. Vinchin was all that stood between him and his family going back to the way it once was. Julian had pushed Davin through his studies, and all that remained was the piece de la resistance. In his hands he held his life's work. Top secret information about the participants of the Assembly of True Swords. Davin couldn't believe his eyes. The book didn't just contain personal information, but the individual habits of each participant along with all their techniques. Julian was extremely proud. Every sacrifice he had made was for this very moment. Goosebumps broke out across Davin's body. The spirit was truly terrifying. It was all starting to fall into place. Julian was planning to make a flashy debut at the Assembly of True Swords by borrowing the strength of the Spirit King. The Miracle Stone caught Davin's attention. Julian explained that the victor of the Assembly of True Swords would obtain the crystal, which was capable of instantaneously increasing the strength of both your body and your mana. As its name implied, it was simply a miracle. The intensity radiating from Julian's demeanor revealed his burning desire for victory. It would be a dishonor to Davin's martial prowess if, despite possessing these insights, he succumbed to defeat. Although Davin wasn't the Spirit King Julian had been anticipating, he promised to give the spirit a far more valuable victory than anything that a simple Spirit King could have accomplished. A single ring of the bell was all it took for Wilson to rush to his master's aid. An errand of the highest importance was in order. She was deep in paperwork when Wilson announced himself at her door. His small talk didn't amount to much, as he entered the Grand Chamberlain's office. The stern woman ordered him to state his business. Wilson had to get this right, for the Grand Chamberlain Raelsa was a 7-star martial artist, who could easily erase him from existence. The young Master Vinci needed her to deliver a message to the patriarch of the family. He wasn't surprised that he lacked the courage to approach his own father. Davin was requesting that the patriarch personally attend and observe his actions at the Assembly of True Swords, as he was intending to prove his worth as a member of the main Adenka family. The Grand Chamberlain hated to disappoint the child, but it was simply impossible. The patriarch never attended the assembly. Wilson laid on the incentive, for this was the cost of embezzling the budget. She was to make possible that which was not. As her deadly stare cut into his soul, he reminded her that he was merely the messenger. With his message delivered, the Grand Chamberlain ordered Wilson to excuse himself immediately. He had never moved so fast in his life to obey a direct order given. The fact that the young master had chosen to send Wilson was a calculated attempt to show his authority. His threat would have carried more weight if delivered in person. A smile spread across her face, for there was a good chance that the child was beginning to understand her intentions. The patriarch sat alone, with his aura blazing bright. There weren't many who dared approach him, but the Grand Chamberlain was a special breed. Diving right in, she passed the message to the patriarch that his youngest son was inviting him to attend the Assembly of True Swords. As he rebuked her for wasting his time, she pushed forward. The young master was intending to prove his worth as a member of the main Adenka family. This was enough to give him pause. He inquired if the Grand Chamberlain believed that Vinchin was up to the task of speaking of the worth of his lineage. She assured the patriarch that if he was, he wouldn't have a need to prove his worth. She begged him to attend, going so far as to put her life on the line as a notary public. The patriarch didn't understand why she was so insistent. Strategically, she explained that it was because the young master was taking advantage of a weakness of hers. And in the time frame of a single day she was left shocked again, after all, like father, like son. For the patriarch brought up her embezzlement, as if it was a casual subject known by all. He had come to the conclusion long ago that her intentions of embezzlement was for the sake of his son, Vinchin. She was the direct servant for the women of the household, not his, so he had no intentions of interfering. The way his son was going about this was very similar to a certain individual. It was a skill to express your intent without losing an ounce of dignity. The simple act made him believe for the first time Vinchin was indeed Sarvana's child. Because of this, he admitted defeat. He would attend the assembly of true swords. The collateral descendants of the Adenka family marched into the Colosseum to the roar of the awaiting crowd. Revan's focus was on a single target, and the others were merely distractions. An honor out of the norm revealed itself. The one and only Patriarch Khan. Revan believed the head of the Adenka family had come in person to watch his ascendance. He wouldn't just beat Vinchin, he would do it in style in front of the most important person in their family. With the contestants in place, the assembly of true swords commenced. Revan had worked himself into a frenzy. His opponents were no match for his prowess. In his current state, he was immune to the weak attacks of his enemy. Between his steel man attribute and his boosted body, not a single opponent was going to be able to stand in his way. His father could care less how big a spectacle he made of himself. His son was in the process of raising the family up. The murmurings of speculations could be heard repeatedly throughout the Colosseum. It ranged from the approval of his title to the fact that there was a good chance that a collateral descendant would rise to the occasion. Davin was surprised. Compared to the standards of 500 years ago, each and every one of these children would be classified as geniuses. But to him they were simply boring, with no depth to be had between the lot of them. Their prowess stemmed from the abilities that was bestowed upon them by their traits. But it was clear that none of them had an ounce of fighting experience. They were merely puppets, dancing to the tune on top of an answer sheet. If that wasn't the case, he doubted Revan would be having such an easy time. At this point, the kid was merely putting on a show. As their eyes crossed, Revan gave praise to Vinchin for not retreating. Davin really hated to disappoint Revan, but there was no chance he would be going anywhere. If anything, he felt his cousin needed to progress the show a little faster. The Patriarch couldn't help but pick up on the animosity bouncing between the two. The crowd was on their feet as Revan's next opponent was taken out in mere moments from a brutal attack that sent him flying. For the safety of the kid, the referee intervened, handing the victory to Revan Adenka. With all his competitors defeated, he stood before the Patriarch to announce his intent to challenge his good friend Vinchin Adenka, as dictated by the laws of their family. Davin stepped forward with a gleam in his eye. He accepted the challenge. Davin and Revan, enemies from their first meeting, stood before the referee, eyes locked, as they prepared for battle. But before they could begin, Devin called off the referee. There were a number of conditions he wanted to impose upon the battle. He called forth his servant Wilson to deliver his wooden practice sword. He would be using it as his weapon along with handicapping himself by only using his left arm, and further increasing the odds. He offered Revan the first 3 attacks. No one understood what was going on. The rumors of the coward Adenka had spread far among the populists. Davin announced his intent to not move from his location until those 3 attacks were completed. The declaration had its intended reaction as Revan's fury rose. The crowd was in complete awe. As the display by Vinchin was absurd, it was known that he didn't possess the capability to be a martial artist. Regardless of him being a direct descendant, this amount of arrogance was beyond reproach. Revan's father wasn't going to stand for this mockery. It was obvious that the coward's intent was to undermine his son's victory. Calling for the Patriarch to intervene. Understanding the severity of the situation, the Patriarch decided to allow it. Speaking directly to Vinchin, he announced that he better prove his words with his actions. Davin had no problem with the declaration as he intended for his actions to speak loud and clear. With that settled, the referee allowed the battle to commence. Revan was so infuriated that Davin had to remind him that he was allowing him the first 3 attacks. Zarin of the White Sword set the combatants loose. Dashing forward, Revan intended to put the Adenka brat down under any circumstance. Davin was relaxed but attentive. Because of his relentless studying, he anticipated the first attack to be a short stab, simply moving out of his way as it passed by harmlessly. Revan wasn't too worried. Usually, his opening attack was nothing more than a feint. Davin was aware of this, and knew the real battle would begin with the second stab. Revan came in hot, but his movements were completely obvious. Even without Julian's training, he would have been able to telegraph his opponent's attack, so used to being carried by his traits, Revan was allowing the basics of combat to slip beyond his grasp. For example, who used a great sword for stabbing. Because of this, Davin was able to deflect the blow with his bare hand. Shock set into Revan's soul. Only someone several levels higher than him would be capable of such a move. With 2 attacks down, Revan's time was running out. He was done with the game. A few tricks weren't enough to change the tide of this battle. His fierce blow, filled with rage, was easily countered with a grapple that sent the inexperienced genius into the ground. The blow to his head sent lightning scattering through his skull. He towered over the blonde with intent in his eyes. He could now keep his promise to both Julian and his father. With the 3rd attack completed, it was time for Davin to enter the battle. Not the crowd, nor the referee, or either of their fathers had expected this to be the outcome. Revan's father had too much on the line to sit back and watch his son be defeated, ordering him to get up. Logically, he shouldn't be struggling against the guy who couldn't use mana. Julian had had enough making his appearance, inquiring what was transpiring. But it wasn't anything more than a basic fight between supposed friends. To Davin, not having a weapon didn't mean much, as the true martial artists were capable of surpassing their enemy even with their bare hands. The blonde retrieved his sword as he forced himself to his feet. Not able to come to terms with the unusual occurrence, his experience led him to the belief that Davin had recently received a blessing. Even so, he refused to acknowledge that such a blessing was anything more than trash bestowed by a minor god. Julian was highly offended by the slight. If he wanted to handicap himself by believing such nonsense, he was welcome to it. He was done hearing the smooth tongue of the Adenka brat, as he attacked with every ounce of his being. This wasn't an attack that could be countered. As the blow came crashing down, he dashed to the left at the last moment, as he prepared to return a strike of his own. In his haste to attack, Revan had left himself open to a counter. He landed a solid blow upside Revan's head. Davin had gotten so far into his psyche. It took Revan's father to remind him of his steel man defense. With the rotting heavenly exoskeleton and an untrained body, Davin had no choice but to use deception to create the opening he needed. Now that Revan's fear of the wooden sword was diminished, his confidence would allow him to make a critical error. Just as expected, he began to attack with the same move for a 2nd time in a row. Between his attack and his enemy's momentum, Davin launched the blonde into the air. He only had one setting when it came to this attack. He was counting on the referee Zarin, doing his best to prevent a tragedy. Zarin was left puzzled by the statement. He only had one chance to execute his plan. Regardless of success or failure, his body would be useless. He sprinted forward as the time to attack was now. His plan had been perfectly executed. His final blow would be dealt as his enemy plummeted towards the ground. Revan did what he could to defend against what was coming, but all the pieces were falling into place as Davin's ability came into view. The trajectory of both their attacks connected as he traced the mysterious sword path. Hopefully Julian was watching because the path to his mastery was on full display. He rose into the air as he completed the line, removing Revan's arm as he activated Absolute Sword Slash. Between Revan's father and the Patriarch, dreams shifted into place and nightmares were revealed. Slicing into the void and reverting the flow of mana, then using it to sever the opponent's skill and everything beyond. This was Absolute Sword Slash. Everyone was witnessing the most tragic event of the day. As the young Revan clenched at his destroyed arm, Davin stepped into the path of the referee, threatening to do whatever it took to be crowned victorious. The subtle prompting worked as Vincent Adenka was crowned the victor. His father rushed in as the White Crown unit did what they could to stabilize the young martial artist. The wound was immune to the application of a simple healing potion, they would need the priest immediately. Davin had no plans of taking responsibility for the severed arm. After all, he had warned the referee. He explained to Julian that while he was at his limit, he would have to power through. Now wasn't the time to rest. He turned to the spirit, wondering how satisfied he was with the performance. Davin called to his father. Proving one's worth as a member of the main Adenka family wasn't an easy task. But today, his youngest son had accomplished that goal. The final victor of the Assembly of True Swords was officially declared as Vinchin Adenka. The patriarch, being a man of few words, invited everyone inside to begin the award ceremony. The ceremony was straight to the point. The miracle stone was presented and awarded to Vinchin, the victor of the assembly. As the reward was being handed to its new owner, the ceremony was interrupted. Revan's father was furious. The nonsense wasn't adding up. He needed to know what trickery was used against his son, accusing Davin in front of the assembly of using the power of an apostle. But his attack was cut off as the priest entered the room with his concerns. The patriarch turned to the priest with respect and querying what had occurred. The priest had exhausted all the means at their disposal. Despite their efforts, the young master's arm couldn't be reattached. For a moment, the father's rage subsided, but upon hearing that his son's arm couldn't be reattached by the priest, he flipped out. The injury was beyond their comprehension. At those words, the spirit began to become worried. Whatever severed the arm cancelled the effect of their divine powers. Time was running short. If they had any hope of recovering the arm, they would need to reach a high priest. The proof Revan's father needed dropped into his lap. A wound that even a third-rank priest couldn't fix. Trickery and deception could be the only answer. This was all it took for rumors of apostles to begin to spread. Davin, with a keen eye, asked permission to handle the situation. The patriarch nodded his head, granting his favor. The assembly had commenced in the presence of the patriarch. And as such, the victor was approved by his authority. Revan's father was essentially questioning the authority of the patriarch. Davin posed the question to Charles Adenka. Was he truly implying he believed his insight was superior to that of the patriarch's? He took the silence for what it was, an admission of guilt. Ordering Zarin of the White Sword Unit to arrest the blasphemous father of his friend Revan. The fool didn't know when he had been outplayed. Playing directly into Davin's hand. He questioned the patriarch's authority in a public setting. Was there anything more he needed to explain? Zarin stepped up, doing as he was commanded, binding Charles Adenka in a manner-restricting chain. The man's fury was etched across his face. The patriarch stepped forward, inquiring if Charles Adenka knew that he was indebted to his son. The laws of the Adenka family doesn't allow for a crime to be charged twice. Vinchin's actions was protecting him from facing the family's sanctions. As a fellow father, he understood the grief the man was in, recommending that the man keep his mouth shut going forward. The patriarch was impressed with his son's actions, leaving Julian extremely happy. Never in his life had he been praised by his father. Hearing such words touched him deeply. Revan's pain pulled at his father's heart, as the priest again tried to heal the young man's arm. If something wasn't done soon, the right arm would be lost forever. Julian knew how to fix the situation, but the cure would affect the both of them, so he left the decision up to Davin. But if it worked out, it would all end in their favor. He stepped to the priest, inquiring if the use of the miracle stone would be enough to fix the wound. The shock on the priest's face told him that it was indeed possible. Being the one who removed the arm in the first place, it was his right to forfeit his reward. His father agreed, leaving the decision up to him. Revan Adenka mocked him on the training field. Charles admitted he could take credit for that as he didn't teach his child well. He deeply apologized, asking forgiveness for his son. Davin retrieved a sword, as words alone wouldn't do. In a single slash, the chains were severed. The moment he saw reflection akin to that of a martial artist, he would use the miracle stone to heal Revan. The sword was dropped at the foot of Charles Adenka. Confused at what was required of him, Davin spelt it out plain. An eye for an eye. Or more precisely an arm. He required someone's right arm to be laid before him. At the very least, the lot of them were merely losers. The father deep in thought, and the son pretending to be aloof of the situation. But out of nowhere, the fire lit in him as he raised the sword to complete the task. Davin was now sure that while the father might struggle, he would do it. There was no doubt that the man loved his son, even if it was a bit twisted. He raised the blade and began to do the unthinkable. He was sure he ordered a certain swordsman to prevent tragedy. Zarin struck, shattering the sword in the father's hand. Charles did his best to catch his breath as his emotions ran the gauntlet. Davin hoped that in the future such courage would be put to a better use. As he promised, the conflict had been resolved. Vincent was indeed living up to the legacy of the main line of Adenkas. Without further ado, he handed the miracle stone over to his son. Time was short, and the priest needed to get to work. He chanted a prayer to the goddess of healing, Gaia. As he consumed the stone, he wished for a miracle to be granted. Divine light burst forth from Revan's arm, casting out the void from within. Tears streamed down his father's face as the blessing was bestowed upon their family. Julian smiled as the precious stone vanished from existence. There was no point in regretting a decision he himself had made. Regardless, it was something that would burn forever. The two had just thrown away an item that would have solved their biggest dilemma. The miracle stone alone would have quenched the thirst of their heavenly exoskeleton. Unbeknownst to them, the lowly eyes of a servant was watching the entire display. Wilson was seeing the light right before his eyes. As the words that had been running through his head since he first heard them came into play. You must choose when the time comes, whether you want to be ruled by fear, or pledge your loyalty. His doubts had been completely washed away. As the father and son embraced, tears streaming down their faces, he decided that loyalty was so much cooler. This was part 1 of Standard of Reincarnation, consisting of chapters 1 through 10. If you enjoyed the manhwa, please check for part 2. And as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.